Hi, Dave Littman, Truth in IT. Welcome to today's webcast, How to Develop and Implement a Ransomware Crisis Plan. Today's webcast will go maybe 25, 30 minutes, maybe 35 minutes. Today's webcast is sponsored by KnowBe4 and ArcServe. In just a second, I'm going to be bringing on Stacy Budd, who's Principal Pre-Sales Engineer with ArcServe, as well as Eric Krohn, who's Security Awareness Advocate with KnowBe4. You'll see a chat panel, so feel free to chat in any comments or questions, and we'll be addressing those toward the end of the event. Because we've got a lot to talk about, without further ado, let me make sure that we have Eric and Stacy here. Are you guys here? Eric, Stacy, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be here. Glad to be here.
All right, awesome, great. All right, so you guys are here. Let me first introduce Stacy Budd. Stacy is Principal Pre-Sales Engineer with ArcServe. Stacy, welcome.
Thank you, Dave.
All right, and Eric Krohn. Eric, as I mentioned, Security Awareness Advocate with KnowBe4. Eric, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, so Stacy, let's start with you, and then we'll swing it over to Eric. So we know that ransomware represents an existential threat to companies of all sizes. But from your perspective, maybe we'll start with the perspective of backup, then we'll go to perspective of social engineering. What do you think are the top things that make a company vulnerable today?
Well, I think number one on my list is just being prepared. Right. So when you look at, if somebody, or when, we really should say, gets infected, where are they going to be recovering from? What point in time? Where is the data going to be coming from? Is it even an option for them? Right? Do they need to look at the possibility of paying the ransom? And if that happens, there's no guarantee that they will get the data back. Right. So a lot of times people don't always prepare the best for it, right? So they're not backing up as frequently, or seeing how they can back up more frequently so they can restore from a closer point in time. And then also, what steps they need to make as far as who they need to notify. Different type of regulatory compliancy may require that they notify different the public and different things like that. So all of those are things that definitely people should be prepared and already have a plan before they ever get infected, so they know what to do.
Okay, that's great, Stacy. And from a high-level overview, is preparing for a ransomware attack from a backup perspective similar to preparing for any other type of disaster, whether it's fire, flood, sabotage, or things like that?
So there will be a lot of similarities. There will be a lot of similarities from a perspective of, hey, can we get our systems back online? Can we do those kind of things, and how quickly can we do it? I think where, it does tend to stray off a little bit will be, the fact that, again, regulatory compliancy, notifying the public, different things like that, depending on whether it's healthcare or legal, type of, or even government, right, might be impacted by those type of things. So there may be some steps above that, right,
okay,
above
great.
The normal disaster.
Okay. So there are some differences, and we'll talk about those throughout this event. Great, Stacy, thank you. Eric, what are your thoughts? Why don't we swing it over to you? Let us know what you think. What do you think, from your perspective, are some of the top things that make a company vulnerable?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, a lot of organizations think it's not going to be them that are going to get hit, that maybe they're too small or they're too well protected. And, we see, unfortunately, time and time again, that that's not really the case, right? So having that attitude that we're safe from this is definitely getting a lot of people in trouble. So you need to think about that. You need to think about, Stacy's absolutely right with the backup strategies there, and making sure that you have those, and the differences between that and a typical, say, a natural disaster sort of recovery piece. It's very different there. But we also need to remember that there's human elements involved in these things, whether it's during the recovery phases, whether it's during how we're presenting the information and our PR sides of things, and even, quite frankly, in avoiding it in the first place by getting people in front of it and not launching the attacks themselves.
Okay. All right. Great, Eric. Thank you. Thank you. Stacy, let's swing it back over to you. Let's get into the details a bit of a ransomware crisis plan. And I know it sounds a bit self-explanatory, but help us understand what is a ransomware response plan and what should it basically consist of?
Well, number one, from a response plan, you have to make sure that you have buy-in from the proper people in the organization, right? So any type of plan is only good as the people that are behind it, right? And also, as I said before, what kind of notifications do you need to have legal be part of that response plan, right? So you already have that planned. Do you need to have, you need to have the steps to recover quickly in there? And also you need to have, in any part of, response plan, the people that are in it, and are documented to be the people involved may not be available, right? So you do have to make sure you have good documentation of the steps to be able to do the restores, to be able to get the data back, and then also be able to, address the issue and all of that as well. And then what kind of notifications need to come into place? Again, financial, healthcare, government, they may need to do different type of notifications. So already have that prepared ahead of time, right? With that, I don't want to say a canned response ready, but an outline so it's quicker to get that up and be available for the people as well to be able to communicate those things.
Is this something, Stacy, that you find companies should build a checklist for?
Checklists are great. They're really a good tool to have. I mean, either a plan or a checklist or those type of things, just to make sure, again, if the people that are normally involved aren't available, then somebody else can easily go through it and implement the steps that need to be implemented.
Okay. So, Eric, let's get your thoughts. In your opinion, is there anything additionally to what Stacy has articulated that you feel is important to having a ransomware response plan?
Yeah, I think Stacy covers a lot of that in there, especially around the communication piece. Something that I would add to that is understand how you're going to communicate. In other words, if your systems are taken down and you don't have email as an option, how are you going to send these notifications? How are you going to communicate with the other people and get status updates and those sorts of things? How are you going to deal with people that may not be on-prem? They may be out in the field or something along those lines. How you're going to communicate these things when your traditional systems are down is also very important. And a lot of people find out the hard way that they have all of the contact information for people in an electronic format. But if that's been taken down by the attack, do you have a hard copy of how to contact these people, what phone numbers to use, alternative email addresses, something that's in hard copy format that may not be encrypted? So I recommend you kind of think through those scenarios from that standpoint, not only the who, but how are we going to communicate these things if it all goes badly?
Okay, great. All right, Eric, thank you. So let's swing it back to you, Stacy. So you touched on this a little bit with getting buy-in from stakeholders early in the process. Are there any other sort of key things that our audience should know about when it comes to building the ransomware response plan? So we know what it is, but are there any sort of tips that you can give to make it easy for them to put this all together?
Well, I think they should go through several different type of scenarios, right? They should have it built up. So, if they're able to restore the data, right, and they're able to minimize the risk and the loss, they might have certain responses planned, for that, and certain steps planned for that. Whereas, obviously, if for some reason they can't restore the data, they can't get back to the data for some reason, have those next steps outlined. So, if it is a worst case scenario, they are prepared for that as well, right? So you're not only preparing for the best case, hey, I'm only losing 15 minutes of my data. It's not a big deal. It happened overnight. We really didn't lose anything key. Those kind of things to, you know what, we can do the restore. Or I've seen companies where they've talked about implementing, solutions, but they don't have them in place yet, right? So, still be prepared, right? To make those communications and everything and those steps on a worst case scenario. So have from a best to worst case scenario planned out, so you're not scrambling at the last moment to be able to implement these things.
And when you say from like best to worst case scenario, you mean in the instance of losing sort of directories to entire systems, to entire data centers, to that whole spectrum.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. And a lot of that data you can protect. You can protect it, continuously. You can protect it, with more of a backup situation where, and with that you may protect it every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour. They really need to take a look at their data, look at the value of their data, and what the risk is to losing that data, and build out the proper plan ahead of time on how they're going to protect that data, so that if they do get hit with ransomware, they know, what their risk versus reward is going to be.
Right, because it could be financial data, or it could be customer data, or it could be other types of data, and depending upon the value to the organization, their response may be different.
Sure. Healthcare is another big one. If you're not able to produce records of a visit, it could cost upwards of $20,000 a record, right? So that could easily, quickly spiral up to be, astronomical charges if they were to lose that data. So.
Okay, great, Stacy. Thank you, Eric. So from a social engineering perspective, what do you see as some of the key steps in building an effective ransomware response plan? So we're talking about building it. Is there anything on top of what Stacy mentioned from his perspective that you'd like to add?
From a social engineering aspect, I don't know that that's necessarily the piece where it goes into building that. Where the social engineering aspects come in is preventing it from having to be enacted in the first place. That's where I really kind of put that information out there, as opposed to the building of the plan, right? Once it's gone on, once you're in this, in this plan where you're working on a crisis plan, it's already happened. The social engineering event has already occurred. So from that standpoint, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think Stacy covered that pretty well.
Okay, Eric, thanks. So let's shift gears a little bit, and let's talk about who in the organization should be involved as being part of a ransomware response team. And you touched on this a little earlier, Stacy, but let me bring it back to you. In your experience, who have you seen that have been stakeholders in this process?
Well, I mean, it should be your C-level leadership, right? Absolutely. Your CEOs, your CFOs, your CTOs, right? But also down to, the IT level, director of ITs. If you are, impacted by, regulations and compliancy that makes you have to communicate, these infections, then definitely, then you look at, people that are in charge of really doing that communication, right? So that could be anyone from maybe a marketing role or a communications role if they have that, department heads, PR roles if they have those, and those kind of things as well. And depending on the organization, it may be, salespeople reaching out to their contacts to say, hey, look, this happened. It's not, it really kind of depends on what the company's focus is and what the company does, but it could be everything all the way down to, salespeople reaching out to their contacts to let them know, hey, this happened. We have it under control. We minimize the loss or whichever, and your data is safe, right? That may be an important communication level that happens as well.
So it's interesting, we think about this as a technology thing, but there is a communications element to it that is really unique here, I think, in this aspect. So, Eric, what are your thoughts? Anything you'd like to add in terms of who in the organization should be involved as part of the ransomware crisis response team?
Yeah, I definitely think there need to be some technical people involved in these, if nothing else, to look at the messaging. Time and time again, when we've seen these breaches happen, when I read the messaging that ends up hitting the press release or the newspaper, sometimes their response and what they're saying doesn't make sense in context to the actual attack that happened, right? And so we have to be careful that what we're putting out there is a reasonable message. In other words, if your organization was hit by ransomware and then you're telling people that they need to go check their bank accounts, that's going to send some pretty mixed messaging. So you need to make sure that the technical people are involved in that messaging and can say, you know what, that really doesn't work in that context. The other folks that I think that we really need to look at and remember in this is whoever does your customer service. Those folks in your call center, those folks that are fielding those calls, because they're going to take the brunt of this. The calls are going to be coming into them quite often. So making sure that they have the right messaging, making sure that they're able to handle those calls in a reasonable fashion, and at least give some information, even if it's we don't have all of the information right now, but we're working on it and we're going to post it at such and such a place. That type of response from a PR standpoint can make all the difference in how your organization is viewed after the fact, because we've seen a number of different ways that this happens and how the organization comes out the other end through fines, through customer feedback and backlash. All of that, so much of it comes back to how it's messaged and whether or not they take responsibility, give clear, concise stuff, or whether it looks like they're trying to cover something up or make it look less than it is. So you need to keep all of those people that are going to be impacted by this or be contacted by this in the loop with some pretty standard messaging too, and make sure that it's consistent across the board.
Okay, great, Eric. Thank you. So let's get to another question, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A here in just a few minutes. But let's talk about practice. We spoke a little bit about DR planning like we traditionally have done, and people go through DR exercises. So what about practicing a ransomware response and coordinating all these folks together? Have you seen that, Stacy, in your experience? And if so, is it something that people should do, and how often should they do it?
Well, I like the fact that, you can automate some of these testing, right? You should automate some of this testing because people do get busy. And a lot of times the DR testing doesn't, happen, or even restore testing doesn't happen as quickly or as often as it should. With automated testing, a lot of times you can do that daily, right? That doesn't mean you shouldn't supplement it and do some manual testing as well, because there's more than just, hey, can I bring the data back? Can I bring that server back online? There's also the people that are going to be involved and those kind of things too. And also you can have a test and say, you know what, let's bring everybody into the room. Okay, you 3 people aren't here today. You're on vacation. So you guys go away. You're not really on vacation. Go back to your desk and go to work. Now let's see how we can be able to address, the issue that we're under at this point as well. So having that plan in place, maybe you want to do that quarterly or to make sure that everybody knows their roles and everything like that. It used to be you tested this stuff yearly, right? I think that, testing more often is definitely going to be important. Now, it may be hard to get C-level people to test and do those kind of things that frequently. They're going to know that what they need to do, and they're going to have their steps. But down to the IT level and that level, I think they should test. I would like to see it done quarterly, and then again, test your backups, test your DR processes, test that as frequently as you can, right? So I think a staged kind of response or testings would be, in my opinion, the way to go.
Okay. All right. Great, Stacy. And before I let you go on that point, do your partners help their clients with DR testing? Oh,
absolutely. So a lot of times, in those cases, they are, depending on the partner, they may be that team that's going to come in and do it for them. A lot of times you have MSPs or things like that where a company may not have the staff in order to be able to do this. So they're going to have to rely on the partner for the different steps that they need to have in place and what they need to do there as well. So they should be a key part of that as well.
Okay, great. All right, Stacy, thanks. So, Eric, let's swing it over to you. You guys are sort of in the business of helping the user community practice not clicking on the wrong thing and avoiding phishing attacks. But, in terms of a ransomware response plan, how often do you think companies should really practice a crisis response?
I think that's a very personal to your company and your organization's culture sort of thing, right? And some of the things that I would take in account in these sorts of situations is your company used to working under high pressure? Because when something like this happens, if you're in an organization that's not used to that kind of pressure during the recovery, you're probably going to want to practice this a little bit more. It's kind of like what we do with the simulated phishing tests is we're trying to build people into a reflexive behavior where it's something that they can do while everything's going crazy around them, right? They don't have to think about it a whole lot. If your organization is already in a situation where it's used to working in these sorts of things, maybe even the MSP side or in somewhere where, downtime for a couple of minutes costs millions of dollars. If you're in that sort of an area, you're probably more used to working under stress. However, for these organizations that aren't, you want to make sure that you're able to run through these plans fairly easily and fairly quickly and confidently when it is kind of crazy around you. And the way you do that is essentially by drilling. So, I like the idea of quarterly at the very least with respect to that. And it doesn't have to be something that's going to take a day or two and down systems, all that kind of good stuff. But at least do your tabletops, at least make sure everyone knows how to communicate with everybody. Test those sorts of things that aren't going to down the systems and see how everybody's going to do. And I love Stacy's idea of remove some people randomly and see how your plan works with that. Remove some of the things that you may otherwise be counting on that may not be there for whatever reason and see how that affects what's going on. Change it up whenever you do this. And I think doing that, you'll be more ready to be agile when it really does happen, which is going to help you recover much faster and probably with a lot less gray hair.
Okay, great. All right, Eric, thank you. So let's keep going before we open it up for Q&A. So Stacy, going to bring it back to you. What are your thoughts on this one? What about a determination on whether or not the company should pay the ransom? Should that be part of the planning process?
Absolutely. I'd like to say nobody should ever pay a ransom, right? But the reality is that a lot of people do make that choice to pay the ransom. Maybe, getting their data back in a timely fashion. They haven't planned very well on that side of things, right? So they may have to pay the ransom, and they need to be prepared for that ahead of time, right? It's not the kind of thing where all of a sudden you're going to jump in and be able to come up with the currency and those kind of things if you make the decision to do that. So you do need to kind of be prepared for that that option if you do it. Be prepared to do it ahead of time.
Okay, great. All right, Eric. Eric, anything to add? What are your thoughts? Is paying the ransom something that our audience should be prepared for ahead of time, or is it, in most cases, sort of a last-second kind of decision?
I think we need to make that consideration ahead of time. I think we always need to think of that because, Stacy touched on a little bit there. Sometimes even getting the cryptocurrency to pay this can be a problem to do within the time. Now, I highly recommend, whenever possible, obviously, that you don't pay the ransom. All we're doing then is filling their coffers for the next attack, right? And I salute some of these folks that stood up and said, you know what, this is bad, but we're not paying the ransom. City of Atlanta, Muni, the Northern California light rail system got hit with ransomware a couple years ago, right on Black Friday, and they said, no, we're not paying the ransom. And they were down for a couple of days. They had to open the gates and let people ride trains for free. And you know what? I applaud them for doing that, for taking that and instead of paying it. But in some cases, if it's something like your intellectual property is now been encrypted and you're going to have to close the doors, obviously you're going to have to pay this. There are situations where there is no recovering from these attacks, or it's going to be extremely difficult to recover from these attacks. And that's why it's so important to think this through in the plan and try to make sure that you have those bases covered, where you don't find yourself in the situation where your only option is to pay these attackers so they can go do it to someone else.
Okay, great. Okay, fabulous. Eric, thank you. Stacy, thank you. Let's open it up for some questions from the audience. There's quite a few here, but let's grab a couple off the top. Let's see. I think, Stacy, you may have touched on this briefly before. So the question came in, and it is, should companies anticipate potentially having to pay in Bitcoin? And if so, are there ways to prepare for that as well?
Well, there are like brokers that you can go through, right? And you can be kind of prepared ahead of time for that. So, coming up with that on the fly, if you haven't prepared for it within the time frame that you're given, it just may not happen. Plus, you may have to get buy-off by CFO level, type people. And it might just be hard to get those steps done in time in order to meet the time frame that you're given, right, to pay the ransom. So, definitely working with a company that specializes with this and already have a relationship with them in case you need in case you do need to pay the ransom, having that prepared ahead of time is definitely to your benefit.
Okay, great. Eric, anything to add?
No, I think that's wise. I mean, to have your bases covered, to know where to get those sorts of things, it definitely can be a challenge. And going to the CFO, quite frankly, and say, I need X number of dollars to put aside in this magical Bitcoin thing or this cryptocurrency that's often used for nefarious goods. And by the way, if we lose it, we'll never be able to recover it, is kind of a hard sell for a lot of places, right? So yeah, you got to look at these alternatives, and sometimes you can make arrangements with people that have them stored, if you will. That you can basically make an arrangement that if something happens, you will be able to purchase them from these folks and do it. And sometimes that kind of escrow thing like that will work out as well. But you really need to understand what's going on, and I recommend too. Go ahead and get an account set up, not necessarily funded, but set up and gone through the paperwork pieces of things where they've validated who you are and met those current regulatory requirements that sometimes take a little bit of time. So if it does happen, then at least you can move quickly. You'll probably end up paying a premium if you need it quickly. However, that may end up being better than losing everything.
Okay. Another question came in. Stacy, let's start with you, then we'll go to Eric. Stacy, so question is, what about cyber insurance policies? Are they available? Should they be seriously considered? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, insurance, that's the great thing of the world, right? So you always pay, hope you never have to use it, but absolutely there is cyber insurance policies out there. Definitely a good idea to get that. It can help you cover that data loss that you have, or at least the cost of that data loss, and help for that. Hope you don't ever have to use it, but it's a good idea to have that as far as that goes, right? So definitely recommend that you have that policy in place.
Okay, great. Eric, any thoughts? Anything you'd like to add? Anything from your experience regarding cyber insurance?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that you need to have some sort of cyber insurance, but you also need to make sure you understand what the cyber insurance covers. And I've done a lot of talks with groups in the insurance industry, and they're still trying to figure out how to put these things together and how to make them make sense. And sometimes they'll layer a cyber on top of your crime policy, and depending on how the attacks happen, it may or may not be covered by one or the other. And there's this kind of gray area sometimes where these things may clash back and forth. So you want to make sure that when you're doing your cyber policies here, your insurance policies, that you know exactly what's being covered, and understand that the cost of a data breach isn't just the loss of your your intellectual property or any of that, but also one of the biggest costs behind the data breaches or a notification like this is the notification costs. Having to get the attorneys involved, having to get this stuff, and sometimes even physically mailing letters. And the notification costs tend to be one of the highest costs in breach recovery. And so people don't think about that a lot. Make sure your policies cover that very, very well.
Okay, great. Let's see, another question here. We got two left. So Stacy, so we touched again on this a little bit earlier with disaster recovery planning, but does your partner ecosystem help their clients with creating a ransomware response plan?
Right, absolutely. Right, make sure that you do have a good partner. There are, a lot of partners out there that offer that as a service, right? So, so that you can be prepared. You do have somebody to help you with it, not only with the preparedness, but with the response as well, right? So there's two steps to it. Having a good partner that will help you develop the plan, work with the plan, and customize the plan for you and your needs, have everything outlined for you, and then also come in and help with the response as well, right? So once it occurs.
Okay, great. Eric, anything to add there?
Yeah, we actually work with a lot of MSPs or MSSPs out there. They can help you with that as well. We have some resources ourselves. The Ransomware Hostage Rescue Guide is a great resource to look at when you're building this plan yourself. Give you some tips, tricks, ideas, things like that you can use. But yeah, I mean, our partner ecosystem is fantastic out there, and they do a great job supporting the end users and the customers very, very well like that.
Okay, great. So let's take one more question, then we'll close it up. This is, I think we might have touched on this, but maybe not. So the question is, does it make sense to involve the legal department or external legal counsel in the ransomware response team? Stacy, why don't you take that, and then we'll get Eric's thoughts.
Right, so absolutely, right? Legal should be involved, right? If you don't have an internal legal group, then you should have some external legal counsel available to you. Depending on the organization, financial, healthcare, government, right? There might be some pretty strict data privacy laws out there, compliance laws as well. So it's a good idea to know what your impact is, right? Know from a legal perspective. Do you need to notify people? What kind of notifications need to be in place? What kind of privacy, requirements are there? Because, when you get to certain kind of things, there may be conflicting things, right? We had a breach, but we can't really tell you who was breached because, that might be, within, we can just tell you a certain percentage of our customer base was breached or something like that as well. So getting somebody that specializes in that from a legal perspective is much recommended here.
Okay, great, Stacy. Thanks, Eric. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, Stacy's definitely on point on this, right? You need real legal help here. Just staying at a Holiday Inn Express does not qualify you as, your legal counsel when it comes to this sort of thing. And you do not want to cross the lines and make things worse in these cases. I mean, we know that ransomware, according to HHS, can be, it can cause a breach. It can trigger a breach notification. Even, regardless, actually, by default, it triggers that. And you can argue your way out of that and show them that the data was previously encrypted, things like that. But there's a lot of things like this that, quite frankly, your legal team is good at tracking that we may not think about. So it's absolutely vital to have a legal team involved and not to try to I hate to use the term, but cheap out here and not involve the legal team right from the beginning. Because again, as things happen here, as things go down, as you're trying to recover from this, if it goes wrong and there are lawsuits involved later on, so much of this information is discoverable, and the emails that go back and forth in relation to all this stuff, all of that can end up showing its ugly head in a lawsuit later. So they have to be involved from the get-go to let you know how to keep yourself safe.
Okay, so we are just about out of time. I want to thank Stacy Budd, Principal Pre-Sales Engineer with ArcServe, And Eric Krohn, Security Awareness Advocate with KnowBe4. If you are interested in developing and implementing a ransomware crisis plan, you can contact either arcserve.com, contact ArcServe, or contact KnowBe4. Check them out at knowbe4.com. So on behalf of Stacy and Eric, thank you very much for spending the time with us today. And thank you to our audience for taking the time to be with us today as well. If we didn't get to your questions, we will have someone from ArcServe or KnowBe4 get back to you. Thanks very much for coming. Thanks for watching. Check out our other videos and webcasts here on truthinit.com. Thanks again. Make it a great day.